In this clip, we're going to learn how to use methods. So we've already had a little bit of experience with methods. We have the start method and the update method. Now, looking at these, we don't exactly know how they are called, but we can see how they are constructed. So let's talk about how to create or construct our first method, and then we'll look at how we can call that method. So let's go down below the update method, and we're going to type in the keyword void. Now, this keyword is used for a method that isn't going to return anything. And so with this, we're going to give it a name. In our case, we're going to call this check if alive. Now, with any method, you can give it a name just like you do with a variable. As long as it doesn't contradict any keywords that come with Unity or Visual Studio, you can name it that way. It's important to know that you should be very descriptive with your functions and variable names, just so that way people can understand what you're doing in your code. Now, with every method, you need to include an open and closed parentheses. Now, typically, by default, these parentheses are empty. Now, you could add information into these parentheses, and this is what's called overloading. Typically, this is being used if something is being returned and we're trying to get that particular information. So we would put something like a variable name in here, and we're just trying to get data, and we're trying to put it into these variable names or these containers. Now, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but I just wanted to mention that there is this process called overloading. So now we'll just go ahead and hit enter, and I'm going to type in curly brackets, so open and close curly brackets. And typically whenever I code, I like to separate the brackets so I know exactly everything that's in between them is code that should be executing. I'll even do the same thing with this update method and the start method. So right before it, just hit enter and it brings them down. And you could even do this with your class. Some people like to have the open curly bracket at the end of a line, but I like to bring them down just so that way I can see things very clearly. So now we have this check if alive function or method, and now we need it to actually do something. So what we're going to do is we're going to see if something is alive. So I'm going to say if, and this is a keyword. Now the if keyword is basically getting you ready for code flow. And what code flow is basically changing how code is moving throughout this script. It's important to know that in a method, code starts at the top and it runs directly down. It moves in order, and whenever it hits an if statement like this, it checks to see if that if statement is true or false based on what you have included, and then it will execute the code in that if statement. If it comes back as false, meaning that the if statement has not been met, it will skip over it and go to the next block of code. So in this case, all we want to do is we want to check to see if, and then we're going to open parentheses, and then inside of these parentheses, this is called the condition. So we want to check to see if the condition is met. So what is the condition? We want to see if is alive is equal to true. Now you'll notice that I used a double equal sign. A double equal sign is a comparison operator, or a logical operator. And what this is doing is saying if this is alive and it is equal to true, or is equal to true, then we want you to do this in the if statement. So this is the condition, And then after this, we need to open and close curly brackets. So if this condition is met, it will execute the code that is in here. And so what I want to do is I just want to print out a message to my console. You could do this a couple of different ways. The way that I like to do it, and I think is the fastest way, is to just simply print, open, close parentheses, and then we'll do open, close quotations. And in this, we're going to put in a message. So in this case, I'm going to say the player is alive. Now we always end our lines of code with a semicolon if it is a statement. Now on the ends of if statements, we are opening and closing with curly brackets, and so that's how it knows when it's began and when it ends. So there we go. Now let's say that if player is alive equals to false, then we want it to print out some other message. So let's say we could do it by typing out another if statement. So is alive. And we could say is equal to false. Or what we could do is type it out this way. We could say not is alive. And this is basically the same thing, or it is the same thing as is alive is equal to false, or double equal sign. This line of code can also be written without the is equal true. It could be written like this. So this is checking to see if it is true. This is checking to see if this variable is false. Now we'll come in and we will open close parentheses, and on this we will print out another message. And we'll simply say print the player is not alive. End with a semicolon, and there we go. Now, with this, looking at these two statements, we have if is alive and if not is alive. We could write this a little bit differently and get the exact same result. So in this, I could actually check to see if the player is not alive and then print out a message. So let's type it up here and say if is not alive, we're going to, actually let's do this. Let's take this and just remove it. And I'm just going to check to see if the player is not alive, and then I'll print out this message. Otherwise, I'm going to always print out the player is alive. So in this case, I'm going to say else, and so with an else statement, you don't actually have to check for a condition. It's either this is met or it's not, and then do this. With an else statement, you do open close curly brackets, and then you will type in print open close parentheses, open close quotations, and we'll say the player is alive. End with a semicolon. It is worth mentioning that if you only have a single line of code in an if statement, you don't have to have the curly brackets. It just needs to be right up against the if statement. So it could be something like this. And then you could also do the same thing with this else statement, as long as there's only one line of code. So if you added another line underneath this, it will not work. So let's hit Control S to save this, and let's see if we can get this to work. So I'll come in and I'll hit play, and we have the same functionality. We'll see that the player is alive function, or variable, is being set to false, and that is coming from the start function. However, we're not seeing anything about a printed message saying whether the player is alive or it's not alive. And so what we need to do is we need to take a look at our code and realize that the method is never called. So the first part of this was constructing the method and giving it the instructions on what it is supposed to do when it is called. So how do you call a method? A method is called by simply stating the function and the parentheses. So we call it by typing it out again. So I could call it in the start function, or what I could do is call it in the update function. So I'm going to say check if alive. Now, anytime that you call a function, you need to make sure that you include the open close parentheses and then end with a semicolon. This is a function or method call. Now let's go ahead and save again by hitting Control S, and let's hit play. Now you'll notice that the message is printing at the bottom and it's saying the player is not alive. It's worth noting that in the console window, you'll see that that message is being printed over and over and over again, and you can see that that counter is continuing to go up. So the reason that is being called over and over again is because we called that function in the update function. Remember, the update function calls something or commits or executes this line of code every single frame that the game is running. So let's go ahead and see what we can do to get that to change from is not alive for the false and showing us if it is alive. So typically what we would do is whenever we're playing the game and we want something to change, we need to do that through script. So there has to be some sort of logic to tell us that the player is alive or it is not alive. I can change the message being printed by simply checking is alive is true. Now you'll see that that is printing out is alive. Now our players do not get to change if the player is alive or not alive at will like this. We have to create some sort of logic to allow that to happen. So typically in game, what we do is we say the player is alive. So let's comment out this line of code in the start, so that way it is not being counted or read, and then we'll just simply play our game. So if we play this, you'll see that the line of code that is being written out to the print or to the console is very different. It says the player is alive. You'll see that it is turned on by default. And then in game, we would do something like if the health reaches 0, then we will say is alive equals false. And there we go. Now that is a very high level look at scripting and a look at functions or methods. And I don't want to get too deep into scripting. I just want to show you how it works, how it is applied to game objects, and then how you can start to create some logic. Now we will have scripts as we go throughout this that we will just assign to game objects, and we will talk about those scripts as we go through. So now that we've talked about scripting, let's move on to our next module.